4 men, 4 screams, 4 bodies crushed beneath the hooves of horses they once owned. The official report called it an accident. The witnesses called it divine justice. But the stablemaster who walked away that night never spoke another word about what really happened in the paddock behind Riverside Estate. And perhaps that silence was the most terrifying part of all. The sound of hooves on flesh is something you never forget. It's not like the movies. There's no dramatic music, no slow motion, just the wet, heavy thud of 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone colliding with a human body. And then, the screaming. Always the screaming. On the night of September 14th, 1864, that sound echoed across the tobacco fields of Riverside Estate in southern Virginia. 4 men died that night, trampled to death by their own horses in what the county coroner would later describe as a tragic accident of unprecedented nature. But accidents don't usually involve 4 separate victims. Accidents don't usually happen to men who've spent their entire lives around horses. And accidents certainly don't leave behind a stable master who disappears into the night without a trace, never to be seen again. The estate still stands today, though the paddock where it happened has long since been paved over. The descendants of those 4 men still live in the area, their family names carved into monuments at the local cemetery. But if you ask them about that night, about what really happened when their great-great-grandfathers died screaming in the dirt, they'll tell you they don't know. Or perhaps more accurately, they'll tell you they don't want to know. Because some stories are better left buried, some truths are too dark to speak aloud, and some revenge is so perfectly executed that even a century and a half later, it still sends chills down your spine. This is the story of Thomas Garrett, a stable master who spent 15 years caring for horses he would never own, serving men who saw him as less than human. This is the story of 4 masters who believed their wealth and status made them untouchable. And this is the story of one night in 1864 when everything changed. The thing about revenge is that it's patient. It waits, it watches, it learns, and when the moment finally comes, when all the pieces fall into place, it strikes with a precision that seems almost supernatural. But there was nothing supernatural about what happened at Riverside Estate. What happened there was purely human, which somehow makes it even more terrifying. Before we continue with the story of Riverside Estate and the men who died there, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What state? What city? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're ready to dive into one of the darkest tales of revenge in American history, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Riverside Estate sat on 300 acres of prime Virginia tobacco land, about 12 miles south of Richmond. The main house was a testament to antebellum wealth. White columns, wraparound porches, and windows that caught the morning sun just right. Behind it, a network of barns, stables, and outbuildings spread across the property like a small village. And at the heart of it all was the stable, where some of the finest horses in Virginia were kept. The estate belonged to the Harrington family, but by 1864, ownership had become complicated. The Civil War had been raging for 3 years, and the Confederate cause was beginning to crumble. Richmond itself would fall to Union forces within 7 months. But in September of 1864, the men of Riverside Estate still clung to their old way of life with desperate determination. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the world these men inhabited. Virginia in 1864 was a place of contradictions. The old plantation system was dying, but its practitioners refused to acknowledge it. The war had devastated the economy, destroyed infrastructure, and killed thousands of young men. Yet the wealthy planters continued to believe they could maintain their lifestyle through sheer force of will. Riverside Estate had been in the Harrington family for 3 generations. Old William Harrington had built it in 1798 with money from tobacco and slave labor. His son Edmund Sr. had expanded it during the prosperous 1830s and 1840s, and now Edmund Jr. and his brother Charles were watching it slowly crumble around them, unable or unwilling to adapt to changing times. The estate had once employed over 100 enslaved people. By 1864, that number had dropped to 43. Some had been sold to raise money, others had escaped to Union lines. A few had died from disease or overwork. The remaining slaves lived in a state of constant anxiety, knowing their world was ending but uncertain what would replace it. There were 4 men who mattered that night. 4 men whose names would be etched into local history, though not in the way they would have wanted. First was Edmund Harrington, the eldest son and nominal owner of the estate. At 42, he was a man who'd never worked a day in his life, but considered himself an expert on everything from politics to agriculture. He'd avoided military service through a combination of wealth and medical exemptions, claiming a weak heart that never seemed to affect his ability to drink whiskey or beat his slaves. Edmund was a man of contradictions. He could quote Shakespeare and discuss philosophy, yet he saw nothing wrong with owning human beings. He prided himself on being a benevolent master, which in his mind meant he only had slaves whipped for serious infractions rather than minor ones. He genuinely believed he was doing his slaves a favor by providing them with food and shelter, never acknowledging that he was the one who'd taken their freedom in the first place. His wife, Margaret, had died in 1859, giving birth to their 4th child. The child had died too. Edmund had mourned for exactly 3 months before taking up with a woman in Richmond, visiting her every Thursday with money he could barely afford to spend. His 3 surviving children were raised by enslaved women who had no choice in the matter. Then there was his brother, Charles Harrington, 3 years younger and twice as cruel. Charles had served briefly with the Confederate cavalry before a riding accident sent him home. The accident had left him with a permanent limp and a burning resentment toward anyone he perceived as beneath him, which was nearly everyone. Charles had never married. He lived in the east wing of the main house, drinking too much and nursing grievances against a world that hadn't given him the glory he felt he deserved. He'd been a handsome man once, but years of alcohol and bitterness had left him bloated and red-faced. He took out his frustrations on the estate's slaves, finding excuses to inflict punishments for the smallest infractions. The accident that had ended his military career had happened during a training exercise. His horse had refused a jump, and Charles had been thrown. The horse had been a spirited young mare named Tempest, and Charles had blamed her for his humiliation. He'd wanted to have her shot, but Edmund had refused, arguing the horse was too valuable. So Charles had kept her instead, riding her hard and punishing her for perceived disobedience. It was his way of maintaining control over something, anything, in a life that increasingly felt beyond his grasp. The 3rd man was Marcus Whitfield, Edmund's brother-in-law and business partner. He owned the neighboring property and had invested heavily in Riverside's tobacco operation. Marcus was a calculating man, the kind who kept detailed ledgers of every penny spent and every slave purchased. He saw human beings as numbers on a balance sheet, assets to be managed and exploited for maximum profit. Marcus was 50 years old, thin and precise, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He'd married Edmund's sister Catherine 20 years earlier in what everyone knew was a business arrangement. Catherine had brought a substantial dowry, and Marcus had brought connections in Richmond's banking circles. They had no children, which suited Marcus fine. Children were expensive and unpredictable. He visited Riverside Estate 3 times a week to review the books and discuss business with Edmund. He had a particular interest in the horses, seeing them as valuable assets that could be liquidated if necessary. He'd been the one to suggest purchasing Thomas Garrett 15 years earlier, recognizing that a skilled stable master would increase the value of their equine investments. Marcus prided himself on his rationality. He didn't beat slaves out of anger or cruelty, but out of cold calculation. He believed that measured punishment was necessary to maintain discipline and productivity. He kept records of every whipping, every punishment, noting the infraction and the result. In his mind, this made him more civilized than men like Charles who acted out of emotion. The 4th was Daniel Cross, the estate's overseer. Unlike the others, Daniel had come from modest means. He'd worked his way up from nothing, and that made him the most dangerous of all. He knew what it was like to be powerless. and he'd vowed never to be powerless again. His solution was to exercise absolute control over everyone beneath him, ruling the estate's enslaved population with systematic brutality. Daniel was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and strong from years of physical labor. He'd been born to a poor farming family in North Carolina, the youngest of 7 children. He'd left home at 15 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to make something of himself. He'd worked as a field hand, a mill worker, a dock laborer. He'd saved every penny, taught himself to read and write, and eventually secured a position as an assistant overseer on a plantation in South Carolina. He'd proven himself ruthless and efficient, and when Edmund Harrington had needed a new overseer in 1858, Daniel had been recommended. Daniel lived in a small house on the edge of the estate, separate from both the main house and the slave quarters. He had no family, no friends, no life outside his work. His entire identity was wrapped up in his position, in the power it gave him over others. He carried a whip at all times, and he wasn't afraid to use it. What made Daniel particularly dangerous was his intelligence. He understood the psychology of control. He knew how to break people down, how to make them afraid, how to maintain order through a combination of violence and unpredictability. He would sometimes show mercy to create hope, then crush that hope to reinforce despair. It was calculated, methodical, and devastatingly effective. These 4 men met every Wednesday evening in the estate study to discuss business, drink imported brandy, and congratulate themselves on their superiority. They called themselves the Riverside Council, as if they were statesmen rather than what they really were. 4 men desperately trying to maintain a dying system through violence and intimidation. Their Wednesday meetings had become a ritual. They would gather at 7 o'clock after dinner. Edmund would pour the brandy, expensive stuff smuggled through the Union blockade at considerable cost. They would smoke cigars, also smuggled, and discuss the week's business. The meetings always followed the same pattern. Marcus would review the financial situation, which was invariably grim. Tobacco prices were falling. The Union blockade was making it impossible to export their crop. Labor costs were rising as slaves became harder to control and more likely to escape. The war was bleeding them dry. Then Edmund would offer optimistic platitudes about how things would improve once the Confederacy won the war. Charles would complain about something, usually the slaves or the Yankees or his leg. Daniel would report on discipline issues and recommend punishments. And they would all drink and convince themselves that their world wasn't ending. But it was ending. They all knew it, even if they wouldn't admit it. The Confederacy was losing. The slave system was collapsing. Their way of life was dying, and they were terrified. That terror made them more dangerous. Desperate men do desperate things. And in the summer of 1864, the men of Riverside Estate were very desperate indeed. And then there was Thomas Garrett. Thomas had been at Riverside Estate for 15 years. He'd arrived in 1849 as a young man of 20, purchased at auction in Richmond for the specific purpose of managing the estate's horses. His previous owner had trained him well. Thomas could calm a spooked stallion with a whisper, diagnose lameness from a horse's gait, and deliver a foal with the skill of any veterinarian. He was, by all accounts, the finest stable master in 3 counties. But Thomas was property. He slept in a small room above the stable, ate whatever scraps were brought to him, and wore the same clothes until they fell apart. He was never allowed to marry, though he'd loved a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house. He'd watched her die of fever in 1857, denied even the dignity of sitting with her in her final hours because Edmund Harrington needed a horse saddled for an afternoon ride. Thomas had been born into slavery in 1829 on a horse-breeding farm in Kentucky. His mother had been a house servant, his father a stable hand. He'd never known his father's name. The man had been sold when Thomas was 3 years old, sent to a plantation in Mississippi. Thomas had only vague memories of him, large hands, a deep voice, the smell of hay and leather. His mother had died when he was 12. Fever, like Ruth. Thomas had been alone after that, raised by the other slaves in the quarters. learning his trade from an old stablemaster named Benjamin, who'd recognized the boy's natural talent with horses. Benjamin had taught him everything: how to read a horse's mood from the position of its ears, how to treat colic, thrush, founder, how to train a young horse without breaking its spirit, how to deliver a foal when the birth went wrong. Benjamin had been patient and kind, the closest thing to a father Thomas had ever known. When Benjamin died in 1848, Thomas had been devastated, but he'd also inherited Benjamin's knowledge, his skills, his reputation, and that reputation had made him valuable. Valuable enough that when his owner had fallen on hard times, he'd been able to sell Thomas for a premium price to Edmund Harrington. Thomas had arrived at Riverside Estate with hope. It was foolish, he knew, but he couldn't help it. Maybe this place would be different. Maybe these masters would be kinder. Maybe he could build something resembling a life. That hope had died slowly over the years. Death by 1,000 cuts. Each casual cruelty, each humiliation, each reminder that he was property, not a person. The hope had died, but Thomas had survived. Because that's what he did. He survived. The horses, though. The horses were different. Thomas cared for 17 horses at Riverside Estate. He knew each one by name, by temperament, by the particular way they liked to be brushed or the specific spot behind their ears that made them nicker with contentment. He delivered their foals, nursed them through illness, trained them with patience and kindness. And in return, the horses trusted him completely. There was Sovereign, Edmund's magnificent bay stallion. 16 hands high, with a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany in the sun. Sovereign was proud and spirited, but he'd never given Thomas a moment's trouble. The horse would come when called, stand patiently for grooming, and nuzzle Thomas's shoulder with genuine affection. Tempest was Charles's grey mare, the one that had thrown him during the war. She was nervous and high-strung, prone to spooking at shadows. But with Thomas she was calm. She would rest her head against his chest and blow softly through her nostrils, a sign of trust and contentment. Midnight was Marcus's black gelding, steady and reliable. Not flashy but dependable, the kind of horse you could count on. Thomas had trained Midnight from a yearling, and the bond between them was strong. And then there was Brutus, Daniel's young chestnut stallion, only 3 years old, still learning, still testing boundaries. Brutus was intelligent and energetic, full of potential. Thomas was training him carefully, patiently, building trust and respect rather than fear. These 4 horses, and the 13 others in the stable, were Thomas's world. They were the only beings on the estate who treated him with genuine affection. They didn't see him as property. They saw him as the person who fed them, cared for them, understood them, and Thomas loved them for it. But he also watched, day after day, as the 4 men who owned these horses treated them with casual cruelty. Edmund used spurs that drew blood. Thomas would find Sovereign in his stall after a ride, sides heaving, foam on his mouth, blood trickling from where the spurs had dug in. He would clean the wounds, apply salve, whisper apologies the horse couldn't understand. Charles whipped Tempest across the face when she balked at a jump. Thomas had seen it happen once, had watched the mare rear up in pain and fear, had seen the welt rise across her delicate nose. He'd wanted to intervene, to stop it, but he couldn't. Interfering would mean punishment, possibly death. So he'd stood there, helpless, and watched. Marcus rode Midnight until the horse was lathered and trembling, then left him standing in the cold. Thomas would find the gelding shivering in the paddock, exhausted and neglected, and would have to spend hours warming him up, preventing colic, undoing the damage of Marcus's indifference. Daniel beat Brutus with a riding crop for the simple crime of being young and spirited. The stallion would shy at something or pull at the reins or show any sign of independence, and Daniel would beat him, not to train him, but to dominate him, to prove who was in control. Thomas said nothing. He couldn't. Speaking out meant punishment, possibly death. So he kept his head down, did his work, and tried not to think about the injustice of it all. He tried not to think about Ruth, cold in the ground. He tried not to think about the scars on his own back from the times he'd been whipped for imagined infractions. He tried not to think about the fact that he was 35 years old and would likely die in this stable, having never known freedom, never known justice, never known anything but servitude. But trying not to think about something and succeeding are two very different things. The summer of 1864 was brutal. The heat pressed down on Virginia like a physical weight, making every breath feel like work. The tobacco plants wilted in the fields despite constant watering. The horses stood in their stalls, heads hanging, too hot to do anything but endure. And the war news grew worse by the day. Confederate defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg the previous year had turned the tide, and now Union forces were slowly tightening their grip around Richmond. General Grant had launched his overland campaign in May, and though the fighting had been costly for both sides, it was clear the Union had the resources to sustain losses that the Confederacy didn't. The men of Riverside Estate grew increasingly agitated. Their Wednesday meetings lasted longer and grew louder. Thomas could hear them through the wall the stable shared with the study, their voices rising in anger and frustration as they discussed their deteriorating situation. He tried not to listen. It wasn't his business. But sound carried through the old wood, and sometimes he couldn't help but overhear. "We're bleeding money," Marcus said one night in early August. "The tobacco's rotting in the warehouses because we can't ship it. The slaves are costing more to feed than they're producing, and the Confederate dollar is worthless." "It'll turn around," Edmund insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Once we win a few more battles, once the Yankees realize they can't break us." "The Yankees have already broken us," Charles interrupted. "We just haven't admitted it yet." There was a long silence. Then Daniel spoke, his voice cold and practical. "We need to liquidate assets, sell what we can while there's still a market. Slaves, horses, land if necessary. Get hard currency and wait out the storm." "Sell the horses." Edmund sounded horrified. "These are some of the finest animals in Virginia. They're worth whatever someone will pay." Marcus cut in. "And right now, that's not much. But it's better than nothing." Thomas felt his heart sink. They were going to sell the horses. His horses. The only beings on this estate who mattered to him. But then Marcus continued, and Thomas's world shifted. "The horses are our most valuable remaining assets. If we're forced to evacuate, we'll need them. But we can't take Garrett with us." Thomas froze, the brush still in his hand, Sovereign's warm flank pressed against his side. "Why not?" Edmund asked. "He's the best stable master in Virginia." "Exactly. Which means he's valuable. We sell him in Richmond before we leave, get whatever price we can, use the money to establish ourselves elsewhere." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. They were going to sell him. After 15 years, after everything he'd done, they were going to sell him like a piece of furniture. "What about the horses?" Charles asked. "Who'll manage them if we sell Garrett?" "We'll hire someone," Marcus said dismissively. "A white man. Someone we can trust." Trust. The word echoed in Thomas's mind. 15 years of perfect service, and they didn't trust him. 15 years of caring for their animals, better than they cared for their own children, and he was still just property to be liquidated when convenient. "I say we do it next week," Daniel added. "Get it done before the market gets any worse. War's making prices drop." They discussed it for another hour, debating his value like he was a horse himself. Thomas listened to every word, and something inside him, something that had been compressed and buried for 15 years, finally cracked. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small room above the stable, listening to the horses moving in their stalls below. And he thought about Ruth. He thought about the scars on his back. He thought about every indignity, every cruelty, every moment of powerlessness. And he thought about the horses. The horses trusted him. The horses loved him. The horses would do anything he asked. An idea began to form. It was terrible. It was unthinkable. It was also perfectly, beautifully simple. But could he really do it? Could he actually kill 4 men? Because that's what he was contemplating, not an accident, not self-defense, premeditated murder. Thomas spent the next 3 days wrestling with the moral weight of what he was considering. He'd been raised Christian, had attended services in the estate's chapel every Sunday, had been taught that murder was a sin, but he'd also been taught that slavery was God's will, that his suffering was part of some divine plan, and he'd stopped believing that a long time ago. What was justice in a world where the law said you were property? What was morality in a system built on the suffering of millions? If the legal system offered no recourse, if there was no way to seek justice through legitimate channels, then what options remained? Thomas thought about the other slaves on the estate. 43 people living in constant fear, subject to the whims of 4 men who saw them as less than human. If he did nothing, if he allowed himself to be sold, what would happen to them? Would the new overseer be better or worse than Daniel? Would Edmund's cruelty increase as his desperation grew? Would any of them survive the war? He thought about the horses. What would happen to them under a new stable master? Someone who didn't know them, didn't understand them, didn't care about them. Would they be beaten more? Neglected? Worked to death? And he thought about himself. 35 years old, about to be sold to a new master, starting over in a new place with new cruelties. How many more years could he endure? How many more times could he watch someone he loved die? How many more scars could his back hold? The moral calculation was impossible. There was no right answer. But there was a choice. Accept his fate and continue suffering, or take control of his own destiny, even if it meant becoming something he'd never wanted to be. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. To understand what Thomas did next, you have to understand what those 15 years had done to him. You have to understand the slow accumulation of trauma, the way cruelty compounds over time until it becomes something physical, something that lives in your bones. There was the time in 1851 when Edmund Harrington had whipped him for allowing Sovereign to throw a shoe, even though Thomas had warned him the horse needed new shoes days earlier. 20 lashes, delivered in front of the other slaves as an example. Thomas had been 22 years old, still new to the estate, still believing that good work would be rewarded. He'd spent a week recovering, sleeping on his stomach, because his back was too torn to lie on. An older woman named Sarah had tended his wounds, applying poultices made from herbs she grew in secret. She told him that the pain would fade, but the scars would remain. She'd been right about both. That had been his first real lesson about Riverside Estate. Good work wasn't rewarded, it was expected. And any failure, no matter how minor or unavoidable, was punished severely. There was the time in 1853 when Charles Harrington had sold Thomas's friend Jacob to a plantation in Georgia, separating him from his family simply because Jacob had looked at him wrong. Thomas had been forced to help load Jacob onto the wagon, to watch his friend weep as he was driven away from his wife and 3 children. Jacob's wife, Mary, had never recovered. She'd stopped speaking, stopped eating. She died 6 months later, and everyone knew it was from a broken heart. The children had been sold separately the following year. Thomas had watched it all happen, powerless to intervene. That had been his second lesson. Love was a weakness. Attachment was dangerous. Caring about someone just gave the masters another way to hurt you. But then he'd met Ruth, and all those lessons had evaporated like morning dew. Ruth had arrived at Riverside Estate in 1854, purchased from an estate sale in Richmond. She was 23 years old, beautiful and intelligent, with a quiet strength that drew Thomas to her immediately. She worked in the main house, serving meals and cleaning rooms, and Thomas would find excuses to walk past the house just to catch a glimpse of her. They'd started talking during the brief moments when their paths crossed. Short conversations, carefully hidden from the overseers. Ruth told him about her life before Riverside, about the family she'd been separated from, about her dreams of freedom. Thomas told her about the horses, about the small joys he found in his work, about the hope he still carried despite everything. They'd fallen in love slowly, carefully, knowing that love was dangerous but unable to stop themselves. They would meet in secret late at night, in the space between the stable and the tobacco barn where the shadows were deepest. They would hold hands and whisper about a future they both knew would never come. For 3 years, Ruth had been Thomas's reason to keep going. She'd made the suffering bearable. She'd given him something to look forward to, someone to care about. They'd talked about running away together, heading north to freedom, but they both knew it was fantasy. The roads were watched. The penalties for escape were severe, and neither of them could bear the thought of leaving the other behind. Then, in January of 1857, Ruth had fallen ill. It started as a cough, then became a fever. Within a week, she was bedridden. Within 2 weeks, she was dying. Thomas had begged Edmund to let him sit with her, to be there in her final hours. Edmund had refused. He needed a horse saddled for an afternoon ride. The request was more important than a dying slave. So Thomas had saddled Sovereign with shaking hands, helped Edmund mount and watched him ride away. And while Edmund enjoyed his leisurely ride through the countryside, Ruth had died alone in the slave quarters, calling for Thomas with her last breaths. Thomas hadn't been allowed to attend her burial. There was work to be done. The horses needed feeding. Life went on. That had been his third lesson, and the most devastating. Nothing he loved would be allowed to survive. The masters would take everything from him, not out of malice, but out of indifference. His suffering simply didn't matter to them. After Ruth's death, something in Thomas had changed. The hope he'd carried, the belief that things might somehow get better, had died with her. What remained was a cold, hard core of survival. He would endure. He would continue. But he would never again allow himself to hope. The years after Ruth's death blurred together. Thomas went through the motions of his life mechanically. He cared for the horses because it was what he did, not because he found joy in it. He ate because his body required fuel. He slept because exhaustion demanded it. But he wasn't really living. He was just existing. There were other incidents, other cruelties. In 1859, Daniel Cross had beaten a young stable hand named Samuel so severely that the boy couldn't walk for a week, all because he'd been too slow bringing a saddle. Thomas had been forced to watch, to stand there and do nothing while a 16-year-old boy was brutalized for a minor infraction. Samuel had recovered physically, but something in him had broken. He'd stopped talking, stopped making eye contact. He moved through his days like a ghost, and Thomas recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look he saw in his own reflection. In 1861, when the war started, there had been a brief moment of hope among the slaves. Maybe the Yankees would win. Maybe they would be freed. But that hope had faded as the war dragged on and conditions at the estate worsened. The masters became more paranoid, more cruel, more desperate to maintain control. There were whippings for minor infractions, reduced rations because food was scarce, longer work hours because there were fewer hands to do the work. The slaves at Riverside Estate were being worked to death, slowly but surely, and everyone knew it. Thomas had watched it all with that same cold detachment. He'd stopped feeling things. It was easier that way. Feeling meant pain, and he'd had enough pain to last several lifetimes. But then came that night in August 1864 when he'd overheard the 4 men discussing his sale. And suddenly, all that carefully controlled detachment had shattered. Because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the horses, the innocent animals who trusted him, who depended on him, who would suffer under a new master who didn't understand them. And it was about justice, or revenge, or maybe they were the same thing. Thomas spent the next 2 weeks in a state of heightened awareness. Every sense felt sharper. Every moment felt significant. He was planning something terrible, and the weight of it pressed down on him constantly. But he was also, for the first time in 7 years, truly alive. The plan came to him over the course of several days. It was elegant in its simplicity, terrible in its implications. It required only 3 things: his knowledge of horses, his access to the stable, and his willingness to cross a line from which there was no return. Thomas knew horses better than anyone at Riverside Estate. He knew their temperaments, their triggers, their fears. He knew that Sovereign, for all his magnificence, was deeply territorial and would attack anything he perceived as a threat to his space. He knew that Tempest was prone to panic, and that once she started running, she wouldn't stop until she'd exhausted herself. He knew that Midnight was a follower who would do whatever the other horses did. And he knew that Brutus, young and spirited, was easily agitated and would lash out when frightened. He also knew something else, something he'd learned over 15 years of careful observation. He knew that horses could be trained to respond to specific signals. A particular whistle, a certain gesture, a specific word spoken in a certain tone. And he knew that horses, when properly motivated, could kill. It wasn't common. Horses were generally gentle creatures despite their size and strength, but Thomas had seen it happen twice in his 15 years at Riverside. Once when a stallion had attacked a handler who'd beaten him. Once when a mare had trampled a man who'd gotten between her and her foal. Both times the horses had been acting on instinct, protecting themselves or their young. But what if that instinct could be directed? What if those protective impulses could be aimed at specific targets? The idea was audacious. It was also incredibly dangerous. If anyone suspected what he was planning, he'd be killed immediately. So Thomas went about his normal routine, caring for the horses, maintaining the stable, speaking to no one about what was growing in his mind. But in the quiet hours when everyone else was asleep, he worked with the horses. He taught them new signals. He conditioned them to respond to specific cues. He built on their existing trust in him, shaping it into something else, something darker. The training had to be subtle. He couldn't do anything that would seem unusual or suspicious. So he incorporated the new signals into his regular routine, making them seem like natural extensions of his normal work. With Sovereign, he began using a specific whistle when the stallion was eating. The whistle meant food, safety, his territory. Thomas would whistle, and Sovereign would eat. Whistle and eat, over and over, building the association. Then he began introducing a second element. He would whistle and then he would place a dummy in the stall, a sack stuffed with hay roughly the size and shape of a man. Sovereign would investigate it, sniff it, and Thomas would reward him with extra grain. But then Thomas began to change the game. He would whistle, place the dummy in the stall, and then make it move. Just a little at first, pulling it with a rope from outside the stall. Sovereign would startle, ears back, and Thomas would praise him. Good boy. Protect your space, protect your food. Over the course of a week, Thomas gradually increased the dummy's movement. He made it more threatening, more intrusive. And Sovereign's response became more aggressive. The stallion would charge the dummy, strike it with his hooves, bite it. And Thomas would reward him every time. It was classical conditioning, the same technique used to train any animal. Stimulus, response, reward. Thomas was just using it for a darker purpose. With Tempest, the approach was different. The mare was already nervous, already prone to panic. Thomas just needed to give her a specific trigger. He chose a gesture, a particular way of raising his hand and moving it in a circular motion. He would make the gesture, then create a sudden noise that would startle Tempest. She would panic, try to run, and Thomas would calm her down. But he never calmed her down completely. He always left her slightly on edge, slightly anxious. And he always made sure she associated the gesture with danger, with the need to run. With Midnight it was even simpler. The gelding was a follower by nature. Thomas just needed to reinforce that tendency. He began exercising Midnight with Sovereign, letting the gelding see the stallion's aggressive behavior. He rewarded Midnight for mimicking Sovereign, for following his lead. Within a week, Midnight would do whatever Sovereign did, no questions asked. And with Brutus, Thomas used the young stallion's natural energy and spirit. He chose a specific word, strike, and began associating it with the command to kick. He would say the word, tap Brutus's hindquarters, and the stallion would kick out reflexively. Thomas would reward him with treats and praise. Over time, the kick became more powerful, more aggressive. Thomas would say, "Strike," and Brutus would lash out with both hind legs, a devastating blow that could crush bone. The stallion thought it was a game, a trick he was learning. He had no idea what Thomas was really training him to do. The other 13 horses didn't need specific training. They just needed to be primed for chaos. Thomas began subtly increasing their anxiety levels. He would make sudden noises in the stable, create unexpected disturbances, keep them slightly on edge. Not enough to seem unusual, but enough that they would be ready to panic if given the right stimulus. It was exhausting work, both physically and mentally. Thomas had to maintain his normal duties while also conducting this secret training. He had to be constantly vigilant, constantly aware of who might be watching. One slip, one moment of carelessness, and everything would fall apart. But Thomas was patient. He'd spent 15 years being patient. He could manage a few more weeks. On September 10th, he overheard Marcus Whitfield tell Edmund Harrington that he'd found a buyer for Thomas. A plantation owner in South Carolina was willing to pay $800. The sale would take place on September 20th. Thomas had 10 days. The timeline was tight, but it was enough. The horses were ready. The training was complete. All Thomas needed now was the right opportunity. The right moment when all 4 men would be together, when the conditions would be perfect, when he could execute his plan and disappear before anyone understood what had happened. The Wednesday meetings were the obvious choice. Every Wednesday, the 4 men gathered in the study. They drank, they talked, they made their plans. And every Wednesday, they stayed late into the night, often until 10 or 11 o'clock. But Thomas needed them outside. He needed them in the paddock, with the horses. And he needed a reason for them to be there that wouldn't arouse suspicion. He spent days thinking about it, turning the problem over in his mind. How could he get all 4 men into the paddock at the same time? What would motivate them to go there in the evening, when the light was fading and visibility was poor? The solution came from an unexpected source. On September 12th, Edmund Harrington announced that he'd invited a potential buyer to visit the estate on Wednesday, September 14th. A wealthy merchant from North Carolina was interested in purchasing several horses, and Edmund wanted to show off his stock. "We'll bring them all out to the paddock," Edmund said at dinner that night, his voice carrying to where Thomas stood in the shadows of the hallway. "Let him see them move, see their temperaments. Garrett will have them ready by 8 o'clock. Thomas felt his heart begin to race. This was it. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. But there was a problem. The buyer would be there. An innocent man who had nothing to do with Thomas's grievances. Thomas would have to find a way to ensure the buyer wasn't present when everything happened. He spent the next 2 days refining his plan. The buyer would arrive at 8. The men would show him the horses. But what if something delayed the buyer? What if he arrived late, after the demonstration had already begun? Thomas knew the roads around Riverside Estate intimately. He'd traveled them countless times, running errands for the masters. He knew which bridges were weak, which paths were prone to flooding, which routes were most reliable. And he knew that the bridge on the main road, about 3 miles from the estate, had been damaged in a storm the previous month. It was still passable, but barely. The county had promised to repair it, but with the war, resources were scarce and repairs were delayed. A few strategic cuts to the support beams, done in the dark of night, and that bridge would collapse under the weight of a carriage. The buyer would be delayed, forced to take a longer route. He would arrive late, too late to witness what Thomas had planned. It was sabotage. It was dangerous. If anyone discovered what he'd done, he'd be hanged. But Thomas was past the point of caring about consequences. He'd already crossed too many lines to turn back now. Thomas made the trip on the night of September 13th. He waited until well after midnight, when everyone on the estate was asleep. He took a saw from the stable, the one used for cutting firewood, and wrapped it in cloth to muffle any sound. Then he walked the 3 miles to the bridge in darkness, moving carefully, avoiding the main road. The bridge was old, built decades earlier from timber that was now rotting in places. The recent storm had weakened one of the main support beams, leaving it cracked and unstable. Thomas examined it carefully by moonlight, assessing the damage. He didn't need to destroy the bridge completely. He just needed to weaken it enough that a heavy carriage would finish the job. So he chose 3 key support beams and began to saw through them, cutting about halfway through each one. The work was slow and exhausting, and Thomas had to stop frequently to listen for anyone approaching. It took him 2 hours to complete the sabotage. When he was finished, the bridge looked intact, but it was now structurally unsound. A man on foot or a single horse could cross safely, but a heavy carriage with 4 horses pulling it would be too much weight. The bridge would collapse, dumping the carriage into the shallow creek below. Thomas felt a moment of guilt. The buyer might be injured in the collapse. But the creek was only 3 feet deep, and the fall wasn't far. The man would be shaken, possibly bruised, but not seriously hurt. And it was necessary. Thomas couldn't allow an innocent man to witness what was about to happen. He returned to the estate before dawn, replaced the saw, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind raced with possibilities, with scenarios, with the terrible weight of what he was about to do. 4 men would die tomorrow night. 4 men who'd spent their lives inflicting cruelty on others. 4 men who'd earned their fate 1,000 times over. But they would still die, and Thomas would be the one who killed them. The moral weight of that decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. He wasn't a killer. He'd never wanted to be a killer. But what choice did he have? What other path was open to him? He could accept being sold, sent away to suffer under new masters until he died. Or he could take control of his own fate, even if it meant becoming something he'd never wanted to be. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. If you're still with me, if you're feeling the weight of Thomas's decision, then you understand the impossible position he was in. This is where we pause for a moment. Hit that like button if you're invested in this story. Drop a comment telling me what you think about Thomas's plan. Was he justified? Or was he crossing a line that should never be crossed? I want to hear your thoughts. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is going to change everything. Wednesday, September 14th, 1864, dawned hot and clear. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds. The kind of day that promised to be beautiful if you didn't know what was coming. Thomas woke before sunrise as he always did. But this morning was different. This morning he knew would be his last at Riverside Estate. By nightfall, everything would have changed. Either his plan would succeed and he would be gone, or it would fail and he would be dead. There was a strange clarity to that certainty. No more waiting, no more planning, just action and consequence. He went through his morning routine with meticulous care. He fed the horses, giving each one their preferred amount of grain. He checked their water, making sure every trough was full and clean. He groomed them, spending extra time with Sovereign, Tempest, Midnight, and Brutus, the 4 horses who would be his instruments of revenge. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Sovereign as he brushed the stallion's gleaming coat. "I'm sorry for what I'm going to ask you to do, but I promise you, after tonight, you'll never be hurt again." Sovereign turned his head and nuzzled Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection. Thomas felt his throat tighten. These horses trusted him completely, and he was about to use that trust to turn them into killers. But what choice did he have? The question kept circling in his mind, over and over. What choice did he have? The morning passed slowly. Thomas cleaned the stalls, repaired a broken bridle, organized the tack room. Normal work, routine tasks, but every moment felt weighted with significance. Every action felt like it might be the last time he did it. At noon, Edmund Harrington came to the stable. Thomas felt his heart rate spike, but he kept his face carefully neutral. "Everything ready for tonight, Garrett?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said, keeping his eyes down. "All 17 horses are in prime condition." "Good. The buyer's supposed to arrive at 8. We'll bring them out to the paddock, let him see them move. You'll handle the demonstrations. "Yes, sir." Edmund studied him for a moment, and Thomas felt a flash of panic. Did Edmund suspect something? Had he given himself away somehow? "You've been quiet lately," Edmund said. "Everything all right?" Thomas forced himself to breathe normally. "Just tired, sir. The heat's been difficult." Edmund nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, rest up. Tonight's important. This sale could bring in enough money to keep us going through the winter." He left, and Thomas exhaled slowly. Hours to go. Just a few more hours. The afternoon crawled by. Thomas went through the motions of his work, but his mind was elsewhere. He reviewed the plan again and again, looking for flaws, for things he'd missed. The bridge would delay the buyer. The four men would grow impatient and decide to demonstrate the horses themselves. Thomas would bring the horses to the paddock, and then it would be too late to stop. At 5 o'clock, Thomas began preparing the horses for the evening demonstration. He brushed them until their coats shone. He cleaned their hooves, checked their teeth, made sure they looked their absolute best. If this was going to be their last night at Riverside Estate, he wanted them to be magnificent. At 6 o'clock, he heard raised voices from the main house. He stepped out of the stable to see what was happening. A messenger had arrived, a young boy on a tired horse. He was talking to Edmund, gesturing animatedly. Thomas moved closer, staying in the shadows, trying to hear. "The bridge collapsed, sir," the boy was saying. "Mr. Patterson's carriage went through. He's unhurt, but the carriage is damaged. He says he can't make it tonight. He'll come next week instead, once the bridge is repaired." Thomas felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. The buyer was safe, but now the four men were angry, frustrated. Would they still want to see the horses, or would they cancel everything? Edmund was scowling. "Damn it, I was counting on that sale." Charles limped out of the house, drink in hand. "What's going on?" "The buyer can't make it. Bridge collapsed." "That old bridge on the main road?" Charles shook his head. "County's been promising to fix that for months. Typical incompetence." Marcus Whitfield emerged behind him, followed by Daniel Cross. The four men stood in the yard, discussing the situation. Thomas watched from the shadows, his heart pounding. "I wanted to see those horses run," Charles said. "Been looking forward to it all week." "We can still do it," Marcus said. "Don't need a buyer to appreciate good horseflesh. Let's have Garrett bring them out, see them move in the evening light." Daniel nodded. "Agreed. I want to see how Brutus performs. Been working with him all month." Thomas felt the world narrow to a single point. This was it. The moment he'd been planning for, preparing for, dreading. Edmund hesitated, then shrugged. "Why not?" "Garrett. Bring the horses to the paddock, all of them. We'll have our own private show." "Yes, sir," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Right away." He returned to the stable, his hands shaking. This was really happening. In a few minutes, everything would change. There would be no going back. Thomas stood in the center of the stable, surrounded by the horses he'd cared for, and he took a moment to center himself. He thought about Ruth, about the life they'd never had. He thought about all the slaves who'd suffered and died at Riverside Estate. He thought about the 15 years he'd spent in bondage, and the fact that he had only 10 days left before being sold. And he thought about justice, or revenge, or whatever you wanted to call it. He began leading the horses out one by one. Sovereign first, the magnificent bay stallion stepping proudly, unaware of what was about to happen. Then Tempest, the gray mare tossing her head nervously, sensing Thomas's tension. Midnight followed, calm and steady. Brutus came next, young and energetic, eager to show off. And then the others, 13 more horses of varying breeds and temperaments. Thomas led them all to the paddock, moving slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to prepare mentally for what came next. The four men stood at the fence, watching. They'd been drinking already. Thomas could smell the whiskey from 20 feet away. They were relaxed, jovial even. This was entertainment for them, a pleasant way to spend an evening. Thomas felt a cold fury settle over him. These men had no idea what was about to happen. They felt safe, secure in their power and privilege. They believed nothing could touch them. They were wrong. The paddock behind Riverside Estate was a large, open space enclosed by a wooden fence. It was where the horses were exercised, where they were trained, where potential buyers could see them demonstrate their gaits and temperaments. In the fading light of early evening, it looked almost peaceful. Thomas led the last horse into the paddock and closed the gate behind him. The horses milled around, calm and trusting. They knew this place. They'd been here hundreds of times before. There was nothing to fear, except tonight was different. Beautiful animals, Marcus Whitfield said, leaning on the fence. Finest stock in Virginia. Garrett's done well with them, Edmund admitted, almost ashamed to sell him. But business is business. They were talking about him like he wasn't there, like he couldn't hear them, like he was as much an animal as the horses. Thomas walked to the center of the paddock. The horses gathered around him, their presence comforting. He reached out and touched Sovereign's neck, feeling the warmth of the stallion's coat, the strength of the muscle beneath. "I'm sorry," he whispered, too quiet for the men to hear. "Forgive me." "Show us Sovereign's paces," Edmund called out. "Let's see him run." Thomas nodded. This was it, the moment of no return. Once he started, there would be no stopping. 4 men would die and he would be responsible. He thought about Ruth one last time, about the life they'd never had, about all the people who'd suffered at the hands of these 4 men, about the 15 years he'd spent in chains. And then he raised his hand in the specific gesture he'd taught Tempest, the signal that meant panic, run, don't stop. The gray mare's eyes went wide, her ears pinned back, and then she reared up, screaming, a sound of pure terror that echoed across the paddock. "What the—" Charles started to say, but he didn't finish. Tempest came down and immediately bolted, not away from the men, but toward them, directly toward the fence where they stood. Thomas had trained her well. The gesture meant danger, and the danger was at the fence, so that's where she ran. The mare crashed into the wooden fence with devastating force. The boards splintered. Charles tried to jump back, but his bad leg betrayed him. He stumbled, and Tempest's flailing hooves caught him in the chest. The sound of ribs breaking was audible even over the chaos. Charles went down hard, gasping for air that wouldn't come. "Garrett, control that horse," Edmund shouted, his face red with anger. But Thomas wasn't trying to control anything. He was just getting started. He gave the whistle he'd taught Sovereign, the specific sound that meant attack, eliminate the threat, protect your territory. The bay stallion's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His ears went flat against his head. His eyes rolled white, and he screamed, a sound of pure aggression that Thomas had never heard from him before. Sovereign charged, not at Thomas, at the men by the fence. Edmund tried to run, but Sovereign was faster. The stallion reared up, his front hooves striking out. One caught Edmund's shoulder, spinning him around. The other came down on his head. The crack was sickening. Edmund dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Marcus Whitfield was screaming, trying to climb the fence, but his hands were shaking too badly. He got one leg over the top rail when Midnight slammed into the fence from the other side. Thomas had trained Midnight to follow Sovereign's lead, and Sovereign was attacking, so Midnight attacked too. The black gelding reared up and came down on the fence, his hooves striking the top rail right where Marcus was trying to climb over. Marcus lost his grip and fell backward, landing hard in the paddock. He tried to scramble to his feet, but Midnight was already there. The gelding's hooves came down again and again, and Marcus's screams turned to wet, choking sounds. Daniel Cross had pulled a pistol from his belt. His hands were steady, his face cold and calculating. He aimed at Sovereign, his finger tightening on the trigger. Thomas shouted the word he'd taught Brutus. "Strike!" The young chestnut stallion wheeled around with incredible speed. His hind legs lashed out in a devastating kick that caught Daniel in the stomach. The pistol fired, but the shot went wild, the bullet burying itself in the dirt. Daniel flew backward, landing 10 feet away. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. Something inside him was broken, and then all 17 horses were moving. The other 13, primed for chaos, had finally panicked. They were running in circles, screaming, their eyes rolling white with fear. The paddock became a maelstrom of hooves and dust and terror, but even in their panic, they avoided Thomas. He stood in the center of the chaos, untouched, a calm point in the storm. 15 years of trust, 15 years of care, and even in their frenzy the horses wouldn't harm him. The four men had no such protection. Charles Harrington was trying to crawl toward the gate, dragging himself with his arms because his chest was crushed and his legs wouldn't work. Tempest came around again, still panicking, still running. Her hooves came down on Charles's back. Once, twice, 3 times. He stopped moving. Edmund Harrington was on the ground, blood pooling around his head. But he was still alive, still conscious. He looked up at Thomas, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and something that might have been understanding. "You," he gasped. "You did this." Sovereign came around again. The stallion reared up and came down on Edmund's chest. And again, and again. Each impact accompanied by sounds that would haunt Thomas's dreams for the rest of his life. Marcus Whitfield had made it to his feet, somehow. He was staggering toward the fence, one arm hanging useless, blood streaming from his mouth. He was crying, begging, pleading for mercy. But there was no mercy here. Not tonight. Midnight and 3 other horses converged on him. He went down under a storm of hooves, and his pleas turned to screams, and then the screams stopped. Daniel Cross was the last one still alive. He'd managed to get to his knees, one hand pressed against his stomach, blood seeping between his fingers. He was looking at Thomas with an expression of pure hatred. "You're dead," he gasped. "You're a dead man, Garrett. They'll hunt you down. They'll hang you. They'll—" Brutus charged from behind. The stallion's shoulder slammed into Daniel, knocking him flat. And then the young horse did what Thomas had trained him to do. He struck. Again and again, his hooves coming down with terrible precision. When it was over, when all 4 men lay still in the dirt, Thomas gave a different whistle, the all-clear signal, the sound that meant safe, calm, rest. The horses slowed. They stopped running, stopped attacking. They stood in the paddock, sides heaving, eyes rolling, but no longer aggressive. Just frightened animals who'd been pushed beyond their limits. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, loud and fast. He could hear the horses breathing. He could hear the evening wind rustling through the tobacco plants. And he could hear nothing from the 4 men on the ground. Thomas walked to each one, checking for signs of life. He found none. Edmund Harrington's skull was crushed, his face unrecognizable. Charles Harrington's back was broken, his body twisted at an impossible angle. Marcus Whitfield's chest was caved in, his ribs shattered. Daniel Cross's neck was bent wrong, his head turned too far to one side. They were dead, all 4 of them. Dead by the hooves of horses they'd owned, horses they'd abused, horses they'd considered property. Thomas felt nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse. Just a vast, empty numbness. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. And now he had to disappear. The estate was chaos within minutes. The screaming, the gunshot, the sounds of destruction had drawn people from the main house, from the slave quarters, from the fields. They came running, and what they found was a scene from a nightmare. 4 men dead in the paddock. 17 horses standing calm and quiet, as if nothing had happened. And Thomas Garrett, the stable master, standing in the center of it all with blood on his clothes and an expression of perfect calm on his face. "What happened?" someone shouted. "What did you do?" Thomas didn't answer. He walked through the crowd, through the shocked faces and the pointing fingers, and headed for the stable. He had maybe an hour before someone thought to stop him. Maybe less. He went to his small room above the stable and gathered his few possessions. A spare shirt, a blanket, a small knife he used for cutting rope. That was all he owned in the world. He could hear the commotion outside growing louder. People were shouting for the sheriff, for the doctor, for someone to make sense of what had happened. But Thomas knew there was no sense to be made. Not in a way they would understand. He climbed down from his room and walked through the stable one last time. The horses that hadn't been in the paddock nickered softly as he passed. He stopped at each stall, running his hand along each horse's neck, saying goodbye. "I'm sorry," he whispered to them. I'm sorry I used you like that. I'm sorry I made you do something that goes against your nature, but I had no choice. You understand that, don't you?" The horses couldn't answer, of course, but they pressed their noses against his hands, warm and trusting, and Thomas felt tears he couldn't afford to shed. He left through the back door of the stable, the one that opened onto the fields. The sun had set completely now, and darkness covered the land, perfect for disappearing. Thomas walked into the tobacco fields, into the night, and he didn't look back. Behind him, Riverside Estate burned with light and noise and confusion. Ahead of him lay nothing but darkness and uncertainty. But for the first time in 15 years, Thomas Garrett was free. The official investigation into the deaths at Riverside Estate concluded that it was a tragic accident. The coroner's report, filed on September 18, 1864, stated that the horses had been spooked by something, perhaps a snake or a loud noise, and had panicked. The 4 men had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the result was catastrophic. The report made no mention of the precision with which the horses had attacked. It didn't note that all 4 men had been targeted specifically, while the horses had carefully avoided everyone else. It didn't question why 17 horses had all panicked simultaneously, or why they'd all attacked the same 4 people. Or perhaps the coroner had noted these things and chosen not to include them in his report, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging something far more disturbing, that a slave had orchestrated the murder of 4 white men using animals as his weapons. That was a truth the authorities couldn't afford to acknowledge. Not in 1864. Not in Virginia, not with the war still raging and the social order already crumbling. So they called it an accident and moved on. No one mentioned Thomas Garrett's disappearance. Or rather, they mentioned it, but only as a footnote. A slave had run away in the confusion. It happened sometimes, especially with the war making everything chaotic. The sheriff made a half-hearted attempt to track him. But with Union forces advancing and the Confederacy collapsing, there were bigger concerns than one missing slave. The truth was, no one wanted to look too closely at what had happened, because if they looked closely they might see things they didn't want to see. They might have to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and revenge and what happens when you push people beyond their limits. So they didn't look. They accepted the official story and tried to forget. The horses were sold off within a month. Sovereign went to a plantation in North Carolina, purchased by a man who'd heard about the tragic accident and wanted the magnificent stallion anyway. Tempest was bought by a cavalry officer who needed a fast horse and didn't care about her history. Midnight and Brutus went to different buyers, their fates lost to history. The other 13 horses were scattered across Virginia and the Carolinas. Some lived long lives. Others died in the war, pressed into service by armies desperate for mounts. None of them ever attacked another human being. The estate itself was seized by Union forces in April 1865, when Richmond fell. The Harrington family lost everything. Edmund's 3 children were sent to live with relatives in Georgia. Charles had no heirs. Marcus's wife, Catherine, moved back to Richmond and lived on charity for the rest of her life. Daniel Cross's small house was burned by Union soldiers, and no one mourned. Riverside Estate was eventually sold to a northern businessman who tried to turn it into a profitable farm using paid labor. The venture failed. The land was sold again and again, changing hands multiple times over the decades. The main house still stands, converted into a museum now, though they don't talk much about what happened there in 1864. It's not the kind of story that attracts tourists, but what really happened that night. That's the question that haunted the survivors, the witnesses, the people who'd seen the aftermath. Some said it was divine justice, that God had struck down 4 cruel men using the very animals they'd abused. Reverend Patterson, who preached at the local church, gave a sermon the following Sunday about the wages of sin. He didn't mention Riverside Estate by name, but everyone knew what he was talking about. Others said it was just bad luck, a terrible coincidence. Horses were unpredictable animals. Sometimes they panicked. Sometimes people got hurt. It was tragic, but it was nobody's fault. A few whispered that Thomas had done something. though they couldn't say what. How could one man make 17 horses attack 4 specific targets? It was impossible, wasn't it? The slaves at Riverside Estate knew the truth, or at least they suspected it. They'd seen Thomas's face that night, seen the calm certainty in his eyes. They'd watched him walk away into the darkness, and they'd known he wasn't coming back. But they didn't tell anyone. When the sheriff questioned them, they claimed ignorance. They'd heard the commotion, come running, found the 4 men dead. Thomas had been there, and then he'd been gone. That was all they knew. It was a lie, of course, but it was a lie they all agreed to tell, because Thomas had done what none of them could do. He'd struck back. He'd achieved something that most enslaved people could only dream of, revenge against their oppressors, and they weren't about to betray him. Thomas Garrett was never seen again. There were rumors, of course. Someone claimed to have seen him in Philadelphia in 1866, working at a stable under a different name. Another report placed him in Canada in 1868, living in a community of escaped slaves. A third insisted he'd died trying to cross into Union territory and was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in Maryland. But the truth is, no one knows what happened to him. He vanished into history, leaving behind only questions and a story that people still tell in hushed voices. Did he make it to freedom? Did he live out his days in peace, finally free from the chains that had bound him for 35 years? Or did he die in the attempt, his body lost to time and memory? We'll never know. Thomas took his secrets with him wherever he went. What we do know is this: 4 men died screaming in a paddock in Virginia on September 14, 1864. 4 men who'd built their lives on the suffering of others. 4 men who'd believed their wealth and status made them untouchable. And they were killed by horses. Animals they'd owned, animals they'd abused, animals they'd considered beneath them. There's a certain poetry to that, don't you think? A certain justice. But was it justice? Or was it murder? That's the question that lingers, the question that makes this story so disturbing even a century and a half later. Thomas Garrett was a slave. He was property. He had no legal recourse, no way to seek justice through legitimate channels. The men who owned him had absolute power over his life, and they'd made it clear they would use that power however they saw fit. So he took matters into his own hands. He used the only tools available to him: his knowledge, his skills, and the trust of animals who'd never betrayed him. Was it murder? Legally, yes. Morally? That's a question each person has to answer for themselves. Consider the context. Thomas had spent 15 years in bondage. He'd been beaten, humiliated, denied basic human dignity. He'd watched the woman he loved die while his master went for a leisurely ride. He'd been told he was about to be sold, sent away to start over with new masters and new cruelties. What would you have done in his position? If you'd spent 15 years in bondage, watching the people you loved suffer and die, knowing you would never be free, never have justice, never have anything but more suffering ahead of you, would you have accepted your fate? Or would you have fought back, using whatever means necessary? It's easy to judge from a distance, from the safety of the 21st century. But put yourself in that stable on September 14th, 1864. Feel the weight of 15 years of cruelty pressing down on you. Hear the men who own you discussing your sale like your livestock. And then ask yourself, what would you have done? The descendants of those 4 men still live in the area. I won't name them because they bear no responsibility for their ancestors' actions. But if you ask them about that night, about the stable master who disappeared and the horses that killed their great-great-grandfathers, they'll tell you they don't like to talk about it. Some stories, they say, are better left alone. Some truths are too uncomfortable to examine too closely. But I think stories like this need to be told. Not to glorify violence, not to justify murder, but to understand the terrible things that happen when human beings are pushed beyond their limits. Thomas Garrett was pushed beyond his limits, and when he finally broke, when he finally fought back, he did so with a precision and intelligence that's almost frightening. He didn't act out of blind rage. He planned, he prepared, he executed his revenge with cold calculation. That's what makes this story so disturbing. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated. Thomas spent weeks training those horses, conditioning them, turning them into weapons. He sabotaged a bridge to ensure an innocent man wouldn't be present. He waited for the perfect moment, and then he struck. And when it was over, he walked away. No hesitation, no regret. Just a man who'd done what he felt he had to do and was now moving on to whatever came next. What became of Thomas Garrett? Did he feel guilty about what he'd done? Did he regret it? Or did he sleep soundly, knowing he'd achieved something that most enslaved people could only dream of? We'll never know, and maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered. What we can say is this: the story of Thomas Garrett and the 4 men who died at Riverside Estate is a story about power and powerlessness. It's about what happens when one group of people has absolute control over another. It's about the terrible consequences of a system built on cruelty and exploitation. And it's a reminder that every action has consequences. The 4 men who died that night had spent years inflicting suffering on others. They'd beaten, humiliated, and dehumanized the people they owned. They'd treated human beings as property and animals as tools. And in the end, those animals became the instruments of their destruction. There's a lesson in that, I think. About karma, about justice, about the fact that you can't treat people and animals with cruelty forever, without eventually facing consequences. The men of Riverside Estate thought they were untouchable. They thought their wealth and status protected them. They were wrong. Thomas Garrett taught them that lesson, and the price of that education was their lives. So what do you think? Was Thomas Garrett a hero or a murderer? Did those 4 men deserve what happened to them? And what became of Thomas after he disappeared into the night? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your theories, your perspectives, your own answers to these impossible questions. If you made it this far, if this story affected you the way it affected me when I first uncovered it, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark history and moral complexity, because there are more stories like this out there. Stories that challenge us, that make us think, that refuse to provide easy answers. Stories about real people who faced impossible choices and did what they felt they had to do. And maybe that's the most important kind of story, the kind that stays with you long after it's over. The kind that makes you question what you thought you knew about justice, about revenge, about the terrible things people are capable of when pushed to their limits. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.